Well, it's been a long time since I've been in this chair, and have to say that I sometimes miss it. But this was a stretch of about 10, 11 days where I didn't seem to have that situation. And I'll be honest with you right now, I actually was able to sleep in some mornings. I was sleeping in some days right up till 5 o'clock, which I guess is how the rest of the world does that. And I actually stayed up late some nights and watched some shows, which I don't normally get a chance to do. And then you start to wonder, though, does anybody actually miss the fact that I'm gone? And I went out of town for a few days, and when I came back, I got the question answered. This is what happened. See if you can figure out what this sound is. This is something that happened when I got home. That's a large black and white furry thing that lives at my house, and at least he was happy that I was back. So if no one else is, it's just good to know somebody out there did miss me. Thank you for joining us today on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you. Coming up now on 8 minutes after 8 o'clock, we're at 19. It looks like the Thursday and Friday this week are going to be perhaps the coldest days of the winter. And we could be looking at some below zero temperatures across the valley before we're done. I was in Idaho Falls for a few days last week. One morning I came out of the hotel and it was a balmy. Well, it warmed up to about 3 degrees, and I went and visited a local museum. And when I got out of the museum, it must have only been about 10:30. It was still about 3 degrees. And then I went to a pub that was owned by a friend and had some lunch. And when I came out of the pub about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it was 6 degrees. But then, late that evening, before I ended up going to bed, I checked the temperature. It had jumped up to 18, and when I got up the following morning, it was 17. Rarely does 17 degrees feel that balmy in that situation. Look, there's a lot to talk about over the next few days. A lot's happened while I've been away, and I do want to thank Steve Millington for filling in last week. He'll be joining us, in fact, this morning between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. We have a lot to talk about, to really catch up with. But a couple of things that caught my attention while I was away. The federal government continues to hammer away on this notion that somehow the Russians, you see, they tried every other excuse, and none of the other excuses would stick to the wall. So now they're claiming it's the Russians and that they have some agreement that the Russians actually harmed the U.S. electoral process, even though it appears the Russians only were looking at emails from one person at the Democrat National Committee. The thing is, liberals are convinced that the Russians switched votes, that they actually got into the voting machines way back during the war with Iraq. Oh, that got started in what, 2003. I was hosting a radio talk show, and all these liberals would call up. You know, the seminar callers, as Rush Limbaugh refers to them? They would call my show, and they would start berating me. They didn't know me. They would rarely listen. These were those people out there, though, who hear there's a conservative talk show host in town, and they've got this image in their head that conservatives aren't as smart as Cabernet-sipping liberals. So they're elitists like them, they know they're the smartest people in the room because they've told each other that multiple times. So they'd call me up and accuse me of believing that somehow Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11. And I would say, well, actually, I don't believe that. Then they would like lose their place because they're reading from their seminar caller's script. And I never believed that. But there were polls out at the time that showed a great many Republicans did believe that. Now, not a lot, but enough that it was substantial. He helping destabilize that part of the world may have been indirectly involved, but there was no direct correlation. Now today, the smartest guy in the room, that is the lefty himself, thinks the Russians were switching votes in voting machines. So who's the dummy out there? It's certainly not Republicans. It obviously is evidence that Democrats are a few beers short of a six-pack. I've got more on all of this. Are you familiar with the name Doug Bandow? Let me spell it for you. Well, you could probably get the first name, right? But Bandow is spelled Bandow. He worked for Ronald Reagan. So this is a guy who has some experience with foreign policy and dealing with baddies all over the world. He has a piece today at National Interest. The title is "Russia is Not the Soviet Union." Now, speaking of Russia, over the weekend, the Washington Post late Friday reported breathlessly that the Russians had hacked into the power grid in Vermont. In other words, if we don't stop them now, they'll be shutting down all of the lights all over the country before we know it. And if you have a heat pump, you'll freeze to death. Well, it turned out that the computer that was infected with some malware was not connected to the grid at all. It was somebody's personal laptop in the office. Secondly, the Post then tried to backtrack and claim, well, it's a type of malware often used by Russian hackers. Okay, but it's the same malware that's available on the internet for sale to all sorts of different people. Just because the Russians buy it, it means other people buy it too. That doesn't mean the Russians did it. So the Post all weekend long gradually backed away from this story, but all of their fellow travelers in mainstream media picked it up and ran with it too. It's fake news. And yet, they're angry with the rest of us. They claim we're reading fake news and that we're being misled. In other words, pay no attention to anybody else. Let us tell you what's going on. Let us tell you how to live. Let us tell you what you need to think. Or Mr. Obama over the weekend saying that his actions promoting solar power and wind power, that fruitcake, he made the claim that actually reduced our dependence on foreign providers of oil. Well, media again picked that up. Hero President Obama has saved the country with his energy policy. Well, no, the reason we're not dependent as much on foreign oil any longer is because something called hydraulic fracturing. Fracking, it's known for short as fracking, which his administration opposed, which was driven by the private sector, even with many regulatory hurdles. That's what reduced it. But again, media reported that fake news. I think these people out there, as I say, the elevator isn't going to the top floor. All right, Doug Bandow, writing at National Interest. He makes a point that I've been making too. Vladimir Putin is not a nice fellow. Okay, understood. We know that. But then, neither are the Saudi royals. I'll go even a step further. Neither is Mad Dog Mattis. But he's there to get the job done, right? Mr. Bandow writes, Russia today is not engaged in a global ideological battle with America. Although Putin may have viewed this Soviet collapse as a geopolitical tragedy, he originally showed no particular animus toward the U.S. Animus meaning he didn't hate us. In fact, he was rather fond of the United States at the time when he took control from Boris Yeltsin in the late 1990s. But his views appear to have hardened in response to Washington's behavior. Now, this is Doug Bandow, former Reagan administration aide. Denizens, he writes, of America's imperial city have trouble recognizing that the rest of the world does not view their motives as pure as those of Vestal virgins. Alas, from a Russian standpoint, ignoring Moscow's Balkan interests, dismantling Slavic friend Serbia, expanding NATO to Russia's borders, absorbing old Warsaw Pact members and Soviet republics, inviting Georgia and Ukraine to seek NATO membership, backing the revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine against Moscow's interests, encouraging a street revolution against an elected Russia-friendly president in Ukraine, and seeking to overthrow the Assad regime, a longtime Soviet ally, are not friendly acts. Not if you're in Russia. You look at these things and you go, wait a minute, these people aren't doing me any favors. So this notion that somehow that the Russians are just this evil presence that, in the morning, Putin gets out of bed and says, it's not how this is working at all. He's not some cartoon villain, okay? Moscow's apparent cyber attack on the Democrats, Mr. Bandow writes, not the U.S. government. Remember that. Not the U.S. government, the Democrats, to which the Obama White House apparently plans to retaliate, actually did Americans a favor, exposing wrongdoing by their own officials and Washington officials who routinely interfere in the elections of other countries have no credibility claiming to be shocked. You mean like Mr. Obama's interference in Israel? Okay, well, yeah, but pay no attention to that. Or Mr. Obama's interference in the Brexit vote? Yeah, but pay no attention to that. Or Mr. Obama's interference in the recent Italian elections? Oh, yeah, well, just pay no attention to that. Or how about Mr. Obama groveling and apologizing on his knees to Angela Merkel a couple of years ago after it was discovered that we had been spying on the German government? Oh, gee willikers. Well, yeah, but see, we're the good old USA and we're Democrats. That makes that right. It's 8:16. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Speaking on, I guess it was special report on Fox last night, Dr. Charles Krauthammer went on to say that, sure, the Russians do this type of stuff too, but there's a bit more going on behind the scenes.
Of course it came from the Russians. I'm sure it's all in the intel. I think it would be a mistake for us to release this. But the Trump people are absolutely right. This is a president who has appeased the Russians from day one. He cancels the missile defense system as he comes into office. Obama did. He then lies down, does nothing about Syria, essentially nothing about Ukraine, does nothing about all the trespasses of the Russians vis-a-vis the U.S. They learn about the hacking 18 months before today. They do nothing at a time when it would actually have an effect. And then all of a sudden, with a month to go, he decides to do this. The timing and the severity of what he did is clearly, this is Obama's revenge on Trump for the birther thing.
What do you say to all this? You hear something like this. And now this explains, I guess, why so many Republicans actually think Barack Obama is just a walking pustule. A vengeful man, but not uncommon, it seems to be, among leading liberals across the country who don't get their way. And then immediately, because everything that they claim they didn't want to see happen before the election, that is, they had to accept the results, etc. These are the things now that they have turned around and gone the other direction, and with the blessing of their allies in mainstream media. Julian Assange, by the way, says it wasn't a Russian government official who gave them at WikiLeaks the details on all of this. But he did leave the door open. It could be that it was a Russian hacker who may not have been working for the Russian government, but it could be it was a Russian hacker. But again, if John Podesta, the Clinton consigliere, if that nitwit hadn't answered an email of what they call a phishing email and given away his password to the hacker in the first place, and again, he thinks he's the smartest guy in any room that he walks into. Clearly, the ding-a-ling turned over all of his party secrets and embarrassed his party before the election. Not that I'm upset with that. It showed you just how devious they were in trying to hand the nomination to his girl versus somebody who might be a challenger, who might be, even if you don't like Bernie Sanders, he was a guy who was at least honest. But they didn't want that in that party, which is, I should point out, still a party for sale to Wall Street, and it also embarrassed all of those big donors, many of whom are infuriated because they thought they'd bought the presidency. And now they didn't get what they wanted. She's lucky she's not been kneecapped. And the same thing with Podesta by some of these people. They're not happy. They put in, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars into this campaign, somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 billion, and they got nothing in return. All right, we've got more on the way in just a few minutes. Oh, there's a great sign. Some of you have probably seen it. When you're going down the interstate and you're headed toward Pocatello, you pass through the Burley Rupert area. There's a guy who's got a sign out there by the highway that says the U.S. should leave the United Nations. Well, he's not alone, obviously, in thinking that. Rich Lowry today, of course, Rich is the editor at National Review, is making the case for the same thing. Did you know that the U.S. pays more than a fifth, nearly a quarter, in fact, of the United Nations budget every year, and 176 other countries who are involved in the UN combined pay less? What are we doing? I mean, this insanity's got to stop. We've got more on the way. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and NewsRadio1310.com. Also, we'll be joined by Steve Millington this morning from the Twin Falls County Republican Party. Yeah, this is the type of music that was appropriate to my discussion about what might happen to John Podesta and Hillary Clinton. They've offended a great many people in that donor class. There's the old line, what is it? Luca Brasi swims with the fishes. Yeah, it's not going to happen here, of course, and we're not recommending that. Right now, there's some liberal out there banging on his keyboard. You know what that guy is like people should do? Talk show hosts don't write laws. We don't enforce laws, and we don't jail you if you don't follow them. We just talk, make conversation, and we're warm and friendly. People know that. I think they understand that. The reasonable people do. I want to mention tomorrow morning, we've got a guest coming in from Tripp Family Medicine between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. We do this every Wednesday and have a medical discussion on the air. And I do want to point out, Dr. Tripp's office is still looking for new patients. And it's centrally located, just from about anywhere. Even people coming from Nevada often stop there because you come straight up Pole Line Road, and he's just around the corner on Fillmore Street, directly across from the main post office. And I've often said this. Now, this is not every time. But generally, if you call up with a medical issue, a pressing medical issue, someone at the office can often see you on the very same day or within 24 hours. So Something to keep in mind, especially if you're a newcomer to the area and you need a new medical practitioner, someone, a new doctor or a physician assistant, to keep that in mind. And remember, life's too short not to feel good. It's 8:22, and I've got 19 still. No serious change in the temperature. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. More today on this thing called Trump derangement syndrome. A lot of people are writing about that. If you go to Real Clear Politics today, you'll see multiple stories about that. Bernie Goldberg and some other people weighing in. I came across this, though, today. A writer from Germany decided to sit down and she penned an article claiming that Donald Trump was obviously the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. The liberals keep making that assumption that, if you don't agree with them, then you're Adolf Hitler. That's how that happens to work. And she said that Germans have learned how they can deal with this. Now, there's a writer by the name of T. Beckett Adams at the Washington Examiner, and T. Beckett Adams shares this. He said there's a quote she says in her story that sort of tips her hand and shows that perhaps she's actually the one. Let me just listen to this. She wrote this. I have plenty of problems with Germany, but its people's willingness to speak their minds and stand up for others isn't one of them. And she went on to say this. Whatever you do in Germany, the public good trumps your individual desires. In other words, the state makes the decision and everybody follows through with that. Does that have a familiar ring in Germany from, I don't know, 75, 80 years ago? But these people, it's almost as if, in a figurative sense, they're dealing with, what's that problem people get with the cloudy eyes? I haven't had it yet. I mean, I'm getting to that age where it'll happen soon. Cataracts. It's almost as if they've got a figurative cataract they can't see through. We've got a caller with us. You're up next. You're on the air at KLIX.
Well, with all this media coverage and so forth about Trump already, and continuing, I think the bottom line is you have to realize the mainstream media, it's either propaganda or out and out lies. Those are the two things. Just totally ignore it, like Rush Limbaugh has said. But you made a comment a minute ago about the United Nations. Yeah, it's been anti-American, pro-totalitarian, pro-communist since its inception. It was most of the people that were in the founding of it. Alger Hiss, of course, was convicted as a communist spy. He was the first Secretary General. A communist has always been the Secretary General. That was the agreement too. So it's time. There's H.R. 1205 is a bill that's in Congress. It'll have to be renamed, of course, or renumbered when the new Congress comes in. And it might still be the same number, but Ron Paul was the one that led that for years and years and years. And people are starting to wake up to the fact that this is where we get the refugee program. This is where we get Common Core. We get all of this nonsense that's killing this country. Regulations through the Agenda 21. It's coming through the EPA. All that stuff comes from the United Nations. It's time to stop funding our own destruction.
And Lowry jumping on board with this. This is a major player in Washington, and people are starting to realize the cost of this thing. He brought up the fact that when they envisioned it, Franklin Roosevelt was a dreamer, and he envisioned that all of the big nations of the planet, originally 4 and then 5, all had the same interests in keeping the lid on violence around the world. Well, when Russia happened to be, the Soviet Union happened to be one of them, that wasn't always the case. And then when they switched from Taiwan to China, that wasn't the case. And if you look at the failed history of the peacekeeping missions in Africa and the Balkans, it's done nothing other than it's a debating society and an anti-American debating society, an anti-Semitic debating society. And this is the result. It's bankrupting this country too as well, or part of that bankruptcy.
Well, it's a war organization, Bill. It's a war organization, the war against free people. And, they basically, the Democratic agenda is the same as the United Nations agenda. It's an agenda that wants to make us part of this one world government. It's the agenda to bring us down to third world status. That's been openly found out about. And so in order to do that, they've been doing all that they can to make us lower our standard of living by cost of energy, the regulations, taxes, redistribute the wealth, and just remember, socialism has never worked. It just results in the loss of individual liberty and freedom and slavery for the people.
Hey, thank you much for the call. And I'll add to that. You have coastal elites who believe that we should go ahead and lower the standards in this country because it would only be fair. But for them, they're looking at protecting their own turf. Was doing some reading about that this morning, and a fellow by the name of Victor Davis Hanson, one of my favorite writers from the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, has a piece about that today at National Review. You can also find that linked at Real Clear Politics. I'll get that out. But he points out that he doesn't go into as much depth, but I believe that seriously, they want people to fade away in flyover country. That is hardworking, working class white Americans, because they don't like us. They don't share our values. They think that if we go to church, we're fools. All of these things have added up. Now, in the 1930s, one of the big reasons Hitler made plans and then in the 40s went ahead and attacked Eastern Europe, he'd been a reader of a writer by the name of Karl Mayes. Karl Mayes was a German who wrote about the American West. And Mayes celebrated the fact that people who he thought were superior moved westward across North America and eradicated the people who were already living there, who he thought were inferior. Now, Hitler read those books as a kid growing up and fell in love with the notion that, well, all we have to do as superior Germans is move eastward and get rid of all of those Slavs. And if you can't gas them all or shoot them all, well, we'll sterilize them and give them contraceptives and feed them a lot of alcohol and give them a lot of drugs, and then they'll just die young and they'll be out of the way and we can take over the land. And now you've got American liberals on both coasts who have that attitude about us. As I mentioned earlier, who is the real Nazi in all of this? It sure as heck isn't Donald Trump. And it sure as heck isn't any Republican I know of or any conservative I know of. But the real threat comes from these coastal elites. Steve Millington's going to weigh in a few minutes. Right now I've got 18 coming up on 8:30. Bill Colley with you too as well on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.